The 73-year-old man stood calmly in line at First National Bank, clutching his pension check with trembling hands. When three armed men burst through the doors screaming, "Get down!" Zrynia, everyone hit the floor in terror. Everyone except Joe. What happened next left the entire SWAT team speechless, because the man they thought was just another helpless senior citizen was actually someone they'd only heard about in FBI training manuals. The security camera footage would later go viral, watched by over 50 million people worldwide. It showed the impossible, an elderly man in a beige cardigan systematically dismantling an armed robbery with the casual efficiency of someone organizing his morning routine. 3 unconscious criminals on marble floors, 0 shots fired, and 1 quiet hero who simply wanted to deposit his pension check. Welcome to True Hero Stories, where we uncover the extraordinary people hiding in plain sight. I'm your host, and today's story will remind you that heroes don't always look like what we expect. Sometimes they're 73 years old, wearing cardigans, and the most dangerous person in the room. If you believe in celebrating real heroes, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we publish incredible true stories of courage every single week. Joe Martinez had been following the same routine for 3 years since retirement. Every first Tuesday of the month, he'd walk the 6 blocks from his modest apartment to First National Bank to deposit his pension check. At 73, with silver hair and a slight limp from an old injury, he looked like any other retiree managing his finances. The bank employees knew him by sight, the quiet gentleman who always said please and thank you, who remembered their names and who never complained about waiting in line. Teller Susan Morrison would always smile when she saw him coming, knowing he'd ask about her daughter's college studies before conducting his business. That Tuesday morning in September started like any other. Joe woke at 6 a.m., made his coffee, read the newspaper, and prepared for his monthly trip to the bank. He dressed in his usual attire, pressed khakis, a beige cardigan his late wife had bought him, and comfortable walking shoes. In his jacket pocket, he carried the pension check along with a small photo of Maria, his wife of 45 years who had passed 2 years earlier. What none of the bank staff knew, what none of his neighbors suspected, was that Joe Martinez wasn't just any retiree. For 32 years, he had been one of the FBI's most elite operatives. His official record was classified, but those who knew whispered about the legend. 847 confirmed takedowns, 0 civilian casualties, and a reputation that made hardened criminals surrender rather than face him. At exactly 10:17 a.m., Joe stood third in line behind Mrs. Henderson, who was making her weekly deposit, and a young mother with a fussy toddler. The bank's atmosphere was peaceful, soft classical music playing, customers chatting quietly, tellers processing transactions with professional efficiency. That tranquility shattered when the glass front doors exploded inward. 3 men in black ski masks burst through, each carrying automatic weapons. The leader, a tall man with visible tattoos snaking up his neck, fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The sound was deafening in the confined space, sending chunks of plaster raining down. "Everybody down! Now! This is a robbery!" he screamed, his voice raw with adrenaline and something darker, desperation. Chaos erupted instantly. Customers dropped to the floor, some crawling behind pillars and benches. The young mother clutched her crying child, pressing them both against the wall. Mrs. Henderson, despite her 80 years, moved with surprising speed to duck behind a planter. Teller Susan Morrison's training kicked in. She immediately pressed the silent alarm button before diving behind her station. The other employees followed protocol, abandoning their posts and seeking cover. But Joe Martinez didn't move. He stood in the exact same spot, his pension check still in his hand, observing the scene with an almost supernatural calm. His pale blue eyes tracked each gunman's position, noting their weapons, their stance, their apparent experience level. Old habits die hard, and Joe's training was assessing threats the way other people breathed, automatically and constantly. The second gunman, shorter but powerfully built, noticed Joe immediately. "Hey, old man! I said get down!" Joe looked at him with the same expression he might use to study an interesting bird. No fear, no panic, just clinical observation. "You deaf, Grandpa," the third robber sneered, walking closer. He was young, maybe early 20s, with nervous energy that suggested this might be his first job. "Get on the ground before I put you there." The second gunman, shorter but powerfully built, noticed Joe immediately. "Hey, old man! I said get down!" Joe looked at him with the same expression he might use to study an interesting bird. No fear, no panic, just clinical observation. "You deaf, Grandpa?" the third robber sneered, walking closer. He was young, maybe early 20s, with nervous energy that suggested this might be his first job. "Get on the ground before I put you there." What happened next would be analyzed by law enforcement agencies worldwide. Security cameras captured every second from multiple angles, creating a masterclass in tactical response that would be studied for years. Joe's first movement was so subtle that Rick didn't even register it as a threat. The elderly man simply shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance. But that small adjustment was the foundation of a technique Joe had perfected over 3 decades of fieldwork. In one fluid motion, Joe's left hand swept upward, deflecting Rick's gun barrel toward the ceiling, while his right hand struck the young man's wrist with surgical precision. The weapon clattered harmlessly across the marble floor as Rick screamed in pain. Joe had dislocated his wrist with a pressure point technique that caused maximum pain, but no permanent damage. The second gunman spun around at Rick's scream, bringing his weapon to bear on Joe. But the elderly man was already moving. Despite his limp and his age, Joe's muscle memory kicked in. He rolled behind a marble pillar with fluid grace, using the architecture of the bank-like cover he'd analyzed the moment he walked in. "What the hell?" the powerfully built gunman shouted, firing wild shots that sparked off marble and embedded in wood paneling. "Who is this guy?" Joe's voice came from behind the pillar, calm and professional. "My name is Joe Martinez. I'm retired FBI. You have 30 seconds to surrender before this gets unpleasant." The leader of the group, still at the teller counter, laughed harshly. "FBI?" "Right, Grandpa. Tommy, flank him. Rick, stop crying and get your backup piece." But Tommy, the second gunman, was no longer laughing. Something in Joe's voice, the way he'd moved, the clinical precision of that disarm, it all triggered survival instincts that came from years on the streets. This wasn't some confused old man. This was a predator. 25 seconds later, Tommy was unconscious on the floor. Joe had emerged from behind the pillar like a ghost, moving with economy of motion that defied his age. Tommy never even saw the strike that dropped him, a precise blow to a nerve cluster that shut down his nervous system instantly. Non-lethal, but absolutely effective. Rick, cradling his damaged wrist, had fumbled for a backup pistol with his off hand. He managed to draw it, but Joe was already there. The weapon flew from Rick's grip before he could aim, and a moment later, Rick joined Tommy in unconsciousness. The leader found himself alone, facing an elderly man in a cardigan who had just neutralized 2 armed criminals in under a minute. His bravado cracked as Joe walked toward him with the measured pace of inevitability. "Stay back!" the leader screamed, pressing his gun against teller Susan Morrison's head. She had been forced to remain at her station to fill the money bags. "I'll kill her! I swear I'll kill her!" Joe stopped exactly 10 feet away, close enough to act, far enough to give the man space to think. His voice remained conversational. "What's your name, son?" "What?" The gunman was rattled, sweat pouring down his face despite the air conditioning. "Your name. I like to know who I'm talking to." Marcus Williams." "Well, Marcus Williams, I can see you're scared. This job went sideways, your partners are down, and you're thinking about how this ends. I want you to know that you have options." Susan Morrison, pressed against Marcus's chest with a gun to her head, was trembling but alive. She could feel the gunman's heartbeat racing, could smell his fear sweat, but she also noticed something else. The absolute confidence in Joe's voice was having an effect. Marcus was listening. "Here's what's going to happen, Marcus," Joe continued, his tone almost grandfatherly. "In about 3 minutes, the police are going to surround this building. They're going to come in prepared for a firefight. If they see you holding Susan, they're going to shoot first and ask questions later. Is that how you want this to end?" No, I don't want to die. Good. That tells me you're smarter than you first appeared. So here's option 2. You let Susan go, you put your weapon down, and you surrender to me. I guarantee your safety, and I guarantee you'll live to see trial. Marcus's grip on his weapon wavered. How do I know you won't kill me the second I let her go? Joe's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Because I gave you my word, and in 32 years of law enforcement, my word has never been broken. The standoff lasted another 15 seconds. Then, Marcus Williams made the smartest decision of his criminal career. He released Susan Morrison, set his weapon on the counter, and raised his hands. Morrison set his weapon on the counter and raised his hands. The Cedar Rapids SWAT team burst through the doors at 10:19 a.m., exactly 93 seconds after the robbery began. They entered expecting urban warfare and found something that defied their understanding of reality. 3 unconscious suspects were arranged neatly on the marble floor. 2 weapons were disassembled and placed safely aside. A third suspect sat handcuffed to a chair. Joe had borrowed the cuffs from security guard Bill Patterson's belt. And standing in the center of it all was a 73-year-old man in a cardigan, checking the pulse of the unconscious criminals to ensure they were stable. SWAT team leader Captain David Morrison, Susan's father, though he didn't know his daughter had been involved until later, approached with his weapon lowered but ready. "Sir, I need you to identify yourself and explain what happened here." Joe reached slowly into his jacket pocket and withdrew a leather wallet. From it, he produced an ID card that Captain Morrison examined with growing amazement. "Special Agent Joseph Martinez, Federal Bureau of Investigation, retired," Morrison read aloud. "Sir, is this legitimate?" "Call FBI Regional Director Sarah Chen in Des Moines," Joe said calmly. "She'll verify my credentials. Authorization code is Alpha 77 Bravo 9. While Morrison made the call, Joe knelt beside Rick Williams, who was beginning to stir. The young man's eyes opened, unfocused and confused. "Easy, son," Joe said gently. "You're under arrest, but you're safe. That wrist is going to hurt for a few days, but there's no permanent damage." Rick looked up at him with a mixture of pain and bewilderment. Who are you?" "Someone who's been doing this a lot longer than you've been alive." FBI Regional Director Sarah Chen's voice came through Captain Morrison's radio with crystal clarity. "Captain, you are speaking with a legend. Agent Martinez's record is mostly classified, but I can tell you that he has more successful takedowns than any operative in Bureau history. Whatever happened in that bank, you can trust that it was handled with maximum professionalism." Captain Morrison looked at Joe with new respect. "Sir, my team needs to process the scene. But I have to ask, how did a robbery involving 3 armed men end with 0 shots fired and no injuries?" Joe was helping Susan Morrison to a chair, ensuring she was physically unharmed before the paramedics arrived. "Experience, Captain. These boys were amateurs. They made emotional decisions instead of tactical ones. Once you take away their weapons and their confidence, they're just scared kids who need guidance." "Guidance?" Morrison couldn't hide his amazement. "Sir, they were armed robbers." "They were desperate young men who made terrible choices," Joe corrected. "Marcus there has a 4-year-old daughter and medical bills he can't pay. Rick is supporting his grandmother on minimum wage. Tommy ... Joe paused, checking the unconscious man's pulse again. "Tommy's been clean from heroin for 6 months, but he relapsed last week and needed money for rehab." Captain Morrison stared. "How do you know all that?" "I asked. While we were talking before you arrived. If you want to stop crime, Captain, you have to understand criminals. These 3 aren't career thugs. They're people who hit bottom and made a desperate choice." The story of the Cedar Rapids bank robbery made national news within hours. Security footage went viral, showing an elderly man in a cardigan systematically dismantling an armed robbery with the casual efficiency of someone organizing his sock drawer. News crews arrived from across the Midwest, but Joe Martinez was nowhere to be found. He had given his statement to police, ensured the suspects received proper medical attention, and simply walked home. When reporters knocked on his apartment door, his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, told them that Mr. Martinez was having his afternoon nap and didn't wish to be disturbed. The 3 robbers were charged and convicted, but their sentences were lighter than expected. Marcus Williams received 5 years with eligibility for parole in 3. Rick Williams got 3 years and was enrolled in a job training program. Tommy received treatment for his addiction and 2 years probation. All 3 men credited Joe Martinez with saving their lives, not just by stopping them from escalating the situation, but by treating them with dignity during the worst moment of their lives. 6 months later, a local newspaper ran a follow-up story. Marcus Williams, now in minimum security prison, had started a program teaching other inmates construction skills. Rick Williams was working as an apprentice electrician and had his grandmother in a good nursing home. Tommy had been clean for 8 months and was volunteering at a rehab center. When the reporter asked Joe about the impact he'd had on the 3 men's lives, his response was typically humble. "They did the hard work. I just gave them a chance to make better choices." But the real story, the one that never made the news, was what Joe had been doing every Tuesday since the robbery. Instead of going to the bank alone, he had been visiting Marcus Williams's 4-year-old daughter, Sarah. Her father had asked Joe to check on her, and the retired FBI agent had taken that responsibility seriously. Sarah Williams would later say that Mr. Joe was the kindest man she'd ever met, and that he taught her that even when people make mistakes, they deserve a chance to do better. Today, Joe Martinez still lives in his modest apartment in Cedar Rapids. He still makes his monthly trips to First National Bank, where he's treated like family by the staff. He still wears his beige cardigan and carries Maria's photo in his pocket. But now, when he walks down the street, people nod with respect. Not because he's famous, but because he represents something rare in our world. The idea that true strength is knowing when not to use it, and that real heroism often happens quietly, without cameras or applause. The FBI has asked Joe to return as a consultant, training young agents in crisis negotiation. He's politely declined, saying his fighting days are over. But every Tuesday at the bank, every visit with little Sarah Williams, every moment he chooses compassion over force, Joe Martinez continues to be exactly what he's always been, a hero who doesn't need recognition to do what's right. The Cedar Rapids bank robbery lasted 93 seconds. In that time, 3 men learned that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who doesn't look dangerous at all. They learned that experience matters, that training never truly fades, and that mercy can be more powerful than violence. But perhaps most importantly, they learned that heroes walk among us every day. They wear cardigans instead of capes, carry pension checks instead of badges, and choose to help rather than harm, even when harm would be justified. Joe Martinez didn't stop a bank robbery that Tuesday morning. He saved 4 lives, 3 criminals who needed redemption and 1 innocent teller who needed protection. He did it without firing a shot, without causing permanent harm, and without seeking credit. That's what real heroes do. They don't ask for thanks. They don't need recognition. They just do what needs to be done, then go home to their quiet lives, carrying their strength like a secret the world is lucky to glimpse, even briefly. In a world that often feels dark, people like Joe Martinez remind us that the light is still there, carried by ordinary people who are anything but ordinary when the moment demands it. If Joe Martinez's incredible story moved you, you need to see what else we've uncovered here at True Hero Stories. Our channel is dedicated to finding the extraordinary people hiding in plain sight, the everyday heroes who prove that courage comes in all forms. Check to Chanel True Hero Stories.